Welcome, everyone, to today's session, Understanding Offending and Reoffending Patterns Among Firearms-Involved Offenders. My name is Susan Howley, and I am on staff here at the Justice Research and Statistics Association. We are so glad to have the opportunity to share this terrific panel with you today. Today's panel is supported by a grant from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is part of the Office of Justice Programs at the U.S. Department of Justice. But all of the views shared today are those of the presenters and do not necessarily represent the views of the Department of Justice. And with that, I'm going to invite today's discussant, JRSA's Roger Przybylski, to say a few words to lead us off. Roger?
Thank you, Susan, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to second Susan's welcome to our second day in JRSA's Criminology series and today's session on research concerning firearms-involved offenders. Firearms crime remains a significant public safety and public health problem throughout the United States. Research indicates that evidence-based violence prevention strategies are most effective when they're highly focused and linked to high-risk individuals and locations. Thus, increasing our understanding of risk for firearms offending and recidivism is important for advancing knowledge and informing practice. This panel presents research using criminal history records and other information to better understand patterns of firearms offending as well as recidivism among firearms-involved offenders. The presentations are based on research conducted by state Statistical Analysis Centers with support from the U.S. Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Statistics. The SACs represent a state and national resource for justice-involved research, and the presentations today on research concerning firearms-involved offenders are prime examples, I believe, of the rich and policy-relevant analytical work being conducted by SACs across the country. So I'd like to now just introduce the three presenters for today's session. And our first presenter will be Stephen Oliphant from Michigan State University and the Michigan SAC. And Stephen's presentation will focus on a study of Detroit's GunStat program by the Michigan SAC, and more specifically on assessing risk among firearms-related arrestees. Our second presenter will be Giovanni Circo from the University of New Haven, and Gio will be presenting on the work he's also been doing with the Michigan SAC on the reoffending patterns of participants in a focused deterrence violence prevention program, namely the Detroit Ceasefire Initiative. And then our third presenter will be Lily Gleicher from the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority and the Illinois SAC. And Lily's presentation will focus on the SAC's examination of the recidivism of firearm offenders using state criminal history and mortality data. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Stephen at Michigan State University and the Michigan SAC.
Thank you, Roger, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. So my name is Stephen Oliphant. I'm a doctoral student at Michigan State University, and I'll be discussing preliminary findings from an analysis of a risk assessment tool being used in Detroit. So the Detroit Police Department and its local, state, and federal criminal justice partners have developed a comprehensive set of crime and violence reduction strategies. So these include people, group, and place-based enforcement, intervention, and prevention strategies. One of the enforcement strategies is known as GunStat. So the GunStat program prioritizes gun-related offenses and involves screening of all gun-related arrestees by law enforcement. So the objective is to identify the highest risk arrestees to prioritize for prosecution with a community-wide goal of reducing future gun violence through deterrence as well as intervention by way of ceasefire and other services. So screening criteria were based on risk factors observed through Detroit ceasefire weekly reviews of shootings and similar criteria being used by law enforcement in other cities, including Tampa and Atlanta. So the criteria are listed here. Gang membership is an indicator of association or membership in a gang. Prior firearm arrest indicates whether the arrestee has ever been arrested for a gun crime prior to their gun stat arrest. Violent criminal history indicates prior conviction of a Part 1 crime. Probation or prison release within the past 3 years indicates whether the arrestee was on probation or parole or had recently been released from prison at the time of their gun stat arrest. In gun context is the count of the number of times an arrestee was involved in a gun-related offense. So these counts are in addition to the prior firearm arrest component above. And also shooting involvement. So there are 3 characterizations here. Associate, which is someone identified by DPD as having been either in close proximity to a person being shot at or an associate of a shooter. Victim is someone who was previously shot or shot at as the target of a prior shooting. And shooter is characterized here as an arrestee who was in a previous shooting and was reported or known to be the shooter if they were not arrested. So we had 2 evaluative research questions. First, we wanted to know if the criteria used in GunStat relate to future offending. So we used chi-square tests and survival analyses to assess this first question. The data that we have were right-centered, which just means that for some, well, actually, a large majority of arrestees, there was no subsequent rearrest. So some arrestees were only technically at risk of rearrest for 3 months if they were arrested for the end of the program, while those in August at the beginning of the study had a longer time period in which they could have been rearrested. The second question, do the criteria relate to an incarceration sentence following the GunStat arrest? So there are 3 different sources of data that we used for the analysis. First, there's the firearm arrest data from DPD. This is for the initial GunStat arrest that occurred between 2017 and 2019. There's the pre- and post-GunStat arrest data from Michigan State Police. So this was used to account for prior arrest history before their GunStat arrest, as well as weapons or violent rearrest following their GunStat arrest. And third, the sentencing data was accessed through the Offender Tracking Information System, which is part of Michigan Department of Corrections. And this was used to determine if the arrestee was sentenced to incarceration as a result of their GunStat arrest. So the sample consists of about 4,800 people who were arrested for a firearm-related offense during the roughly 2-year period between 2017 and 2019. The mean age was 31. About a third had a prior firearm arrest, a prior arrest for a non-drug, non-traffic offense in the past 6 years, and about a third were recorded by DPD analysts as having previously been arrested for a firearm offense. For measures, some of the models that I'll talk about here include the total GunStat score, while others include the individual scoring components that make up that total score. And then also age and arrest history were included as control variables. Arrest history was included either as the total number of recent arrests or a count of 4 different types of arrests, which included weapons, violent, property, and disorder arrests. So as I mentioned, the first research question we have had to do with reoffending. So our outcomes include the time to weapons and violent rearrests. Here, weapons-related arrests included arrests for offenses involving a firearm or weapon. So there is a little bit of overlap with violent rearrests in terms of if there was a homicide committed with a firearm, that would also fall into our weapons rearrest category. And time to weapons or violent rearrest uses the first arrest for either a weapons-related or a violent offense following the initial GunStat arrest. As I mentioned, due to the nature of the data, the number of days until the rearrest event or study completion differed, so that was taken into account in the analysis. It's also important to note for our rearrest analysis, it includes only the arrestees who were not sentenced to incarceration following their Gunstead arrest. And so the second research question we're examining, incarceration is measured here as a dichotomous measure of whether a Gunstead arrestee was sentenced to incarceration following that Gunstead arrest that we recorded. I'll be talking about a number of rearrest tables in the next several slides, and then I will finish up with the incarceration models. This slide presents results from our chi-square tests. So about 7% of the arrestees were arrested for a weapons-related offense in the study period following their Gunstead arrest. There were significant differences observed between those who were and were not rearrested on most of the Gunstead scoring components. The proportion of rearrestees who had Gunstead scores greater than or equal to 11, which is a threshold used in the Gunstead program, is nearly twice that of those who weren't rearrested. So approximately 21% versus 11%. For violent rearrest, 8% were rearrested following their Gunstead arrest. The differences in proportions here for each of the Gunstead components between those who were rearrested and those who weren't were fairly similar to the results on the previous slide. Two exceptions being rearrestees were more likely to have a violent criminal history, and then there were no significant differences for prior involvement as a shooter. About 12.5% were rearrested at some point during the study period for a violent or weapons-related offense. And again, this is also consistent or similar to the last two slides. So now the next three slides examine the relationships between the Gunstead scoring components and the risk of future rearrest for weapons or violent offenses. So these are our survival analysis models. So prior firearm arrest and having been a victim in a previous shooting increased the risk of being rearrested for a weapons-related offense. Age was negatively associated with rearrest risk, and recent prior arrest totals were positively associated with risk of rearrest. And now looking at a violent rearrest, for being a victim, no significant association here with rearrest risk. The protective effect for age remained as it did for the weapons rearrest. So the risk of rearrest was lower for older arrestees. And prior arrest total and prior firearm arrests, again, remain significant predictors of rearrest. Now looking at either a weapons or violent rearrest outcome, similar to the weapons rearrest model, prior arrest total, prior firearm arrest, and having been the victim in a previous shooting increased the risk of rearrest. And age, again, with a protective effect. The next three slides also examine rearrest, but instead include the total Gunstead score instead of the individual scoring components. So the numeric measure of our total Gunstead score was a significant predictor of weapons rearrest, and including the total score also resulted in a significant improvement in the model as determined by a likelihood ratio test of the two models. The counts of weapon and property arrests in the past 6 years were significant predictors in both models, so when Gunstead was controlled for and when it was left out. When the Gunstead score was removed, the hazard ratio for the count of recent weapons arrests increased from 1.43 to 1.73. Little change among the other counts. So for violent rearrest, again, the total Gunstead score is a significant predictor of rearrest here and improved the fit of the model. Violent and disorder arrest counts are significant predictors, but not weapons-related rearrest. And finally, looking at either a weapons or a violent rearrest. So the total gun stat score, again, is a significant predictor of violent rearrest and improves the model fit. Absent the gun stat score, all 4 counts of arrests were significant predictors of rearrest. So just a brief summary before I move on to the incarceration models. From a bivariate approach, there were significant differences between the 2 groups on most of the individual gun stat scoring components, regardless of the type of rearrest outcome that we looked at. Recent arrest history and having previously been arrested by DPD for a firearms offense significantly increased the risk of rearrest. As expected, age had a protective effect on reoffending. Arrestees who were assessed by DPD as having been a victim in a prior shooting were at higher risk of being rearrested on a weapons offense, but not on a violent offense. And again, arrestees with higher gun stat scores had an increased risk of rearrest. The next few slides address our second research question, which sought to understand if and how the gun stat criteria relate to a sentence of incarceration. About 10% of the arrestees were incarcerated following the initial gun stat arrest. There were significant differences for most of the scoring components. About a third of those who were incarcerated had previously been convicted of a violent crime, compared to just 13% of the non-incarcerated group. The results here are from a logistic regression with incarceration as the dependent variable. So arrestees who were incarcerated following their gun stat arrest were more likely to have been assessed by DPD as having most of the scoring components here. Those who received an incarceration sentence were about twice as likely to have been recently system involved. And now, again, looking at the 2 different models with and without the total gun stat score, as was the case with the survival analysis regressions for rearrest, including the total score resulted in a significant improvement in the model fit, and as you can see, it was a significant predictor of incarceration. In bivariate analyses across groups, so rearrest versus no rearrest, there were significant differences for most scoring components. Shooting involvement and violent history were the only criteria that were offense-specific in terms of their differences. In the survival analyses, prior firearm arrests and total gun stat score were consistent predictors of rearrest across the models, in addition to the ARC control variable for measuring total recent arrests. In terms of focusing on the arrestees that are considered high risk, the relatively small number of arrestees sentenced to incarceration did appear to be those who were assessed as high risk based on the gun stat criteria. So given that a higher gun stat score is a predictor of rearrest and a sentence of incarceration when recent history was controlled for, it appears the assessment is operating as it was intended to. And finally, with the high volume of gun-related cases, tools such as GunStat that inform decision-making may be useful. So beyond informing prosecution, such a screening tool may be helpful to identify arrestees for outreach and intervention services like ceasefire, which Dr. Shirko will be talking about. Just a few limitations to mention. First, we weren't able to estimate the overall impact of GunStat on city or community levels of violent crime, given the program is citywide and relatively new. We did not have demographic information for the full sample, so we couldn't look at differences across sex or race. We weren't able to account for the time spent in custody and jail following an arrest, which impacts the time an arrestee is at risk of being rearrested or essentially reoffending. This last point is state-specific, but the current analysis is not able to look into how HIDA might affect rearrests. So in Michigan, the Holmes Youthful Trainee Act allows for the dismissal of certain offenses by youth offenders, which would include people that are between the ages of 17 and 24. But we're currently looking into how to obtain more complete information to include HIDA in the analysis. And I will pass it on to Dr. Circo now.
Hi, everybody. Thanks. Thank you, Stephen. Let's see. Oh, yeah, good. So they're on to our new slides here. So what I'm going to talk about today is some research that we did a while back, where we were looking at some of the reoffending patterns of some of the participants in a focused deterrence program that we were doing in Detroit. And so in Detroit, for some background, starting back in late 2013, Detroit started its own focused deterrence program that they were calling Detroit Ceasefire. And so the goal of this program was to try and reduce gang and group violence in a specific part of the city. And so when the program first went into effect, it was focused primarily on these two precincts on the eastern part of Detroit, the 5th and the 9th precinct. And so based out of these two precincts, the program went into effect where the working group for ceasefire was identifying individuals who were known members of groups or gangs. And so we say groups and gangs, were a lot of the activity that occurs in Detroit isn't necessarily what we think of as a very traditional hierarchical gang. A lot of it has to do with small street groups, street gangs, or neighborhood groups. And so that doesn't really match sometimes what we think of when we think of, maybe a really large hierarchical gang in maybe Chicago or LA, for example. But anyway, the goal here was that we wanted to try and identify people that were involved in violence, bring them to call-in meetings, and deliver a deterrent message to them. So, this playbook kind of might sound familiar. It's really the general way that a lot of these focused deterrence programs have gone into an effect. And so the program started in 2013. We went through quite a number of revisions of the program. And so starting off, it was difficult to get some buy-in from the police department. And so by 2015, we eventually were able to get a city manager involved. We had a project manager. The program really did start taking off around 2015. And by then, we had a number of call-in meetings where we had brought in groups of known offenders, individuals that were under some sort of correctional supervision, and delivered deterrent messages to them. So when we got to the evaluation stage, what we wanted to look at was whether or not there was any evidence of violence reduction that we could attribute to the ceasefire program. And so going in, we had some, feeling that there would be some effect, because we look at other research on focused deterrence, and in general, there's fairly strong evidence that it does have some impact either on community level crime or on individual level offending. The issue is there's considerably more data on community level offending and a lot less data on individual level offending. And as you'll see in a minute, the former is much more difficult to evaluate because you have to get fairly detailed information on individual call-in invitees. And so when we looked at the violence reduction in some of these targeted precincts, we did observe at least some evidence of a community-level reduction, relatively modest, maybe 13 or 14% reduction in fatal and non-fatal shootings. And we broke this down by age groups. It was primarily between the 15 to 24-year-old category. And so also makes sense. These are when we think about focused deterrence programs in targeting people that are involved in groups and gangs involving firearms violence, they tend to be within those rough age categories. One of the big limitations of this initial evaluation we did was that when we did a comparison group, and so we looked at when we looked at people that had been invited to call-in meetings, this initial evaluation, we are comparing. It was an issue where we weren't necessarily comparing apples to apples, we would say. And so we drew a comparison group, and we were able to match on some variables. But one of the issues was that they weren't group or gang involved. And the reason that's an issue is that there are some qualitative differences when we think about individuals who have been identified as being group or gang involved. And so a number of different things can go along with that. And so when you get added to when you're under the gang intelligence unit's data system, you might be more likely to be contacted by police. They have a better idea of who you are. And so when we wanted to do a more robust evaluation of what's the effect of ceasefire, we wanted to generate a comparison group that was made up of group and gang involved individuals who looked really similar demographically to people that had been involved in these call-in meetings, but for whatever reason had not been attending them. And so we wanted a strong comparison group. And so we worked with the gang intelligence unit to try and get some of this information. And so, when we were carrying out a quasi-experimental design like this, our goal is to generate a comparison group that's as similar as possible to those people that were invited to a call-in meeting. And so, to do this, we worked with the gang intelligence unit. They provided us with a list of all the individuals who they had identified as being involved in a group or gang. And we took this information and we ran it against a very large criminal history data set that was provided to us by Michigan State Police. So the Michigan State Police has information on arrest histories and adjudication data on anyone that's been arrested or convicted or sentenced in Michigan. And so what we were able to do then is link up the criminal histories of people that were invited to call-in meetings and link up the criminal histories of people that were not invited to call-in meetings, and then winnow that down to generate a comparison group that is a relatively good match to those people. So we started with a list of several 100,000 individuals because this is a very large data set, and then we were able to break it down to a group of individuals that was most similar. And so when we look at the tables here, so these are some demographics of our call-in invitees. And so if we look at this table here, it's broken down by call-in meeting. And so you can see on the left-hand side, the first call-in meeting was on August 29th, 2013. And so that meeting, there were 16 individuals that attended. Their average age was about 23.8, 24. And then we can see what their arrest history was, their arrest history up until that point. And so in general, if you look across all call-in meetings, most of them have had, multiple arrests. A lot of them have had violent arrests. And so what we want to do then is try to identify, based on these variables, other individuals that look demographically very similar. So things like finding a group of people who are also under correctional supervision, who are also gang involved, but did not attend a call-in meeting. So it's a very specific group But because we have access to so much data, we can find a reasonable group that will match on things like age, or their prior number of arrests, or match on the overall demographics of each call-in meeting. So we can kind of do this in a stratified way as well. So, you know, I won't go too in depth with all the nuances here, but what we were able to do then is from our really large list of offender data and arrest history data, we're able to generate a comparison group of 335 individuals who were also gang and group involved, who are also under correctional supervision, just like our call-in group, and who looked relatively similar to those individuals that attended the call-ins. And then what we did next is we applied something called inverse probability weighting. And so if you ever heard of propensity score matching, it's similar in spirit to that, where we're going to look at the variables in the treatment group, and then we're going to basically generate a model that weights those variables based on the importance, and then we can use that to re-weight our comparison groups so they look more similar. And so if we look at our comparison group, the weighted values in terms of age and prior arrest history and so on are very similar to that treatment group. And so, you know, we look at the average age in the comparison group is 24.9, and the average age in the treatment group is 25.38, and so on and so on. And so we can get relatively close to those demographics. And so when we do the comparison, we're going to be more certain that we're doing an apples-to-apples comparison. So when we looked at the results, just the raw difference between these two groups, about 51% of those ceasefire individuals were arrested after 3 years, and compared to 59% in that weighted comparison group. About 15% were arrested for a violent crime after 3 years, compared to 18% in the comparison group. And about 9% were arrested for a weapons offense, compared to 12% in the comparison group. And this is just the raw 3-year demographics, or raw findings. And if we plot that out, we can see year over year, we can see that overall, if we look at all arrests and violent arrests, 2 and 3 years out, there are some substantial differences between the call-in group and the comparison group. And so just like Stephen mentioned, we implied also a survival analysis. And so a survival analysis is going to be useful because, rather than just looking at 1, 2, and 3 years in these rough blocks, we can look at how long on average it takes people in either group to be rearrested. And so in this case, we're looking at the survival curves, the differences in arrest and time to rearrest between these two different groups. And so the blue shaded areas are the estimates for the call-in, the ceasefire group, and the red is the one for the non-ceasefire group. And so in the top 2 panels, we can see that overall, for both any arrest and violent arrest, the number of ceasefire clients or call-in invitees is substantially or significantly higher in terms of not being arrested. So if you look at the violent arrest after 3 years at the end, we can see the differences overall in arrest rates there. And so we have, between these 3 different analyses, we have fairly strong evidence that after adjusting for all these other factors, that individuals that were invited to these call-in meetings, who actually attended these call-in meetings, had a longer time to rearrest. And so overall, we found that there was about a 29% reduction in all arrests, But more importantly, we found there was about a 40% reduction, 47% reduction in violent crime arrests, which makes sense because, first of all, this is the primary target of the program, is to reduce the rearrests in violent offenses. And so we have fairly good evidence here that people that were delivered a deterrent message saying, we're watching you, we do want you to be involved in violent activity anymore, and then also give them a way out. There was pretty strong evidence here that relative to our comparison group of people who look very similar, that the decrease was a result of those call-in meetings. So, when we look at the overall program of Detroit ceasefire, we have some evidence of community-level violence reduction, which is, when we look at it in different ways, is anywhere from fairly small to modest. But a lot of the benefits we observe are really at this individual level. And, as I mentioned before, there's substantially less research on this individual level because of a lot of the complexities that go along with how do you develop a comparison group, how do you perform these individual level analyses. It's much easier in a lot of cases just to look at aggregate crime statistics for an entire city or an entire police precinct. And so when we really drilled this down to the individual level and looked at the program under a microscope, we were able to see that a lot of these effects are really quite robust, especially in relation to violent offenses. And so this gives us a lot of confidence that, at the very least, the ceasefire program is having some substantial effect on individual level offending. We're still doing some work looking at community level offending, but in general, we're really finding that a lot of the benefits are at the individual level. And I think because of the fact that the call-in meetings and the program really focus on delivering an in-person message to individuals, that this individual level effect is in some ways not surprising. So, we kind of find that overall the ceasefire program really requires a lot of different elements to make it work, including response teams to respond to shooting incidents, enhancing crime analysis to identify these people. So we mentioned this analysis is really only possible because we had data from the Gang Intelligence Unit and the Crime Analysis Unit at DPD to provide us a list of people that were also identified as being gang involved, but also had not been invited to a call-in meeting. And so we were lucky that we had access to that types of data. And then, thinking about actually implementing the call-in meetings or in custom notifications and coordinating with federal and local prosecution, there's a lot of resources that go into these call-in meetings. And so, I think in terms of the looking at implementing these programs elsewhere, we have to be aware, first of all, the amount of resources and coordination that it requires to implement focused deterrence like this, and then also thinking about how do we allocate the resources that we need for a good evaluation. We kind of sometimes don't think about the fact that we really need fairly detailed data to properly evaluate a program like this. And so it really wasn't until later in the program that we had access to enough data through Michigan State Police, through the Gang Intelligence Unit, that we were able to come up with this analysis. And so I've had other people ask me about this, and I always say that data, the results are only going to be as accurate as the data you can give us. And so we've always been advocates for trying to get as much detailed data as possible. And I think this really highlights a lot of those issues that go along with that. And so we've been quite lucky that we've been able to do this because we have, we've built up these partnerships from the beginning. Okay, so I think that's it for me. So I think I'm going to pass this on to Lily now. So let me go ahead and give you the thing.
All righty. Thank you. So my name is Lily Gleicher. I'm from ICEJA. That's what we call ourselves. Thank you all for the opportunity to present this research today. There's a link that I've just sent to all attendees. This report has actually been published on our website. I'm presenting this research, but I will say that the actual study and report was written by 4 other people, and there's some that have retired and some that are no longer with our agency. So I am reporting out for them, but had some help and had some hand in helping with all this as well. So, so there are a couple different purposes for this this study, and what I'll say is what Stephen and Dr. Circo both kind of spoke to. You'll hear some similarities, so I won't go too in depth into the nitty-gritties on that because they did some of that for me. But there were kind of multiple purposes to demonstrate the utility of state criminal history records. So kind of what Dr. Circo was just talking about. At ICEJA, we have access for research purposes to the Illinois State Police Criminal History Record Information System, which is essentially rap sheets. It includes arrest charges, court dispositions, and sentences. We also, for research purposes, have Illinois Department of Correction data and Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice data. The main thing I'm going to be talking about today is what we did to examine individuals involved in first-time firearm-related offenses, their recidivism patterns, and mortality. And I'll go into a little bit of that. And then the other kind of thing that we looked at as part of this was not only could we connect all these different types of data sources, which I'll speak to in a second, but how statewide data sources could be linked together to more precisely determine offending exposure time. So that time that they're actually in the community at risk for offending. And then whether analyses that include this exposure time information would differ from analyses without exposure time consideration, and I'll touch on that when we talk about the findings. Roger did a really good job describing kind of the background and why this research is important, but homicides accounted for 7.8% of injury-related deaths for the CDC in 2018 nationwide. A large portion of those involved firearms. I won't go too much into this, but firearm-related deaths are a significant cause of mortality in Illinois. And the research has shown somewhat higher recidivism for individuals with weapon-related prior offenses, and also individuals with criminal records, but specifically longer or lengthier criminal records, also have higher mortality rates compared to no or short criminal histories. So kind of a large study design. If you click on the link, you'll note the actual report is about 80 pages, so I'm really focusing on just kind of the specifics for examining recidivism and the differences between firearm and non-firearm related offenders. So for the study methodology, the first thing that we did was, and this is, again, I won't go too in-depth on this, is we looked at different data connections. So we obtained the study sample from our Criminal History Record Information System, or what I'll call CRI. We also had Illinois Department of Correction data, or IDOC data, for exposure time and reincarceration. We were able to work with the Illinois Department of Public Health to obtain death certificates for mortality data. And also the CRI data was used for arrest and conviction data. So kind of more specifically, some of the findings that I'll be talking to are more descriptive, but also recidivism rates for a 10-year period using survival analyses and regression analyses, and then mortality findings, which are kind of incorporated into those recidivism rates and recidivism analyses. So some descriptive and bivariate analyses for mortality findings, but also mortality-adjusted recidivism rates. So there are several different data sources that we used. So arrest records come from Criminal History Record Information System, or CRI. So to do convictions. And then the Illinois Department of Corrections, or IDOC data, we obtain administrative data, and we can link these on different unique identifiers or different bridges that we have in-house at our organization. And then from the Illinois Department of Public Health, we were able to get civil death certificates to identify mortality. And what we did is we looked at a 10-year follow-up accounting for incapacitation time, or time at risk, and we use CRI and IDOC data for that as well. And so to kind of give you an idea of what our study looked like, the study sample included a pool of approximately 379,000 unique individuals with arrest records in CRI in 2003. So 2003 was the kind of starting point that we looked at. And using Courson's exact matching techniques, so somewhat similar to propensity score matching, but we matched individuals who were first-time firearm-involved arrestees. Sorry, there might be a cat fight going on in the background. So we used, what we did was we took from that group of unique individuals in 2003, and we identified first-time firearm-involved arrestees, and then we did a one-to-one match comparison group using Courson exact matching, and we matched on 16 different demographic, geographic, criminal charge, and prior criminal history related criteria, and created a matched non-firearm involved arrestees comparison group. So that's what you'll see here. There are just over 4,000 in each of the groups. So the treatment group being that firearm involved arrestees, the comparison group or match comparison group being the non-firearm involved arrestees. The other thing we did is we also kept in this group of about just under 2,000 first-time firearm involved offenders without a suitable match, which we call the unmatched firearm involved group. And we kept this in for further analysis. And the reason why we did this as well was because this group had tended to be more serious offenders or commit a more serious firearm-related offense in 2003. So just some sample characteristics. As you can see, what we have is arrest charge comparisons of all 2003 arrestees in CRI compared to the study sample. So what you'll see is that predominantly in 2003, for that approximately 379,000 unique individuals arrested, most of them were for Class A or B misdemeanors. But when we look at the total study sample, which includes the firearm and matched non-firearm group and the unmatched firearm group, a very large percentage had felonies for that 2003 arrest. Now, when we look at the comparison of study sample with Illinois' general population in all 2003 arrests, what we can see is, there's a pretty even split between genders, but when it comes to 2003 unique arrests for that kind of pool of people that we use to create our sample, higher proportion of males, and then even higher proportion of males in the study sample. We also see a difference when we look at race, 73% identifying as white, and then when it goes to the 2003 unique arrestees, just a slightly higher percentage are identified as white, but then when we look at the total study sample, a higher percentage identified as Black. As you can imagine, even though the general population, 43% live in Cook County, which is still a large portion of the population to live in a small area, what you will see is that arrests tend to come from Cook County, for not only for the unique 2003 unique arrests, but also for the total study sample. And then for the general population, what we see is 15 to 24-year-olds tend to make up a higher proportion of 2003 unique arrests, and they also for the total study sample as well. When we look at a comparison of the study sample, so this is after when we've matched the groups, obviously the matched firearm involved group and matched non-firearm involved group have the same, generally the same matches because we created that through Courson's exact matching. What you'll see is slight difference is the non-firearm involved group, I'll call NFI and FI, had a slightly lower mean number of prior arrests, but otherwise generally fairly similar. And minimum age at first arrest was pretty similar, except for the maximum age. But then when we look at the unmatched firearm involved group, what we see is we look across, obviously across here, we see that there's, it's the same, but there's a significantly higher proportion in the unmatched firearm group that identified as Black. And there's also a higher number of prior median and mean arrests for this group, which really is just an indication that this group consists of a more serious offenders or more serious firearm-involved offenses at that time. So overall findings. So about 2/3 of all first-time firearm arrests were for nonviolent firearm offenses. The unmatched firearm unmatched FI group had a higher proportion of violent firearm arrests, and a higher proportion of the matched firearm involved arrests than the unmatched firearm involved arrests were convicted for the 2003 arrests. So this is where we can see some of the conviction rates for the matched firearm involved group, the matched non-firearm involved group, and then the unmatched group. So generally what you'll see is we'll do comparisons between these two, the matched groups, and then the matched firearm and unmatched firearm to see the differences between those groups as well. Among this group as well, 15% were admitted to prison for their 2003 conviction. And I guess to kind of preface, step back a second, the outcomes that we looked at were rearrests, but specifically I'll speak to firearm rearrests, any new convictions for arrests after a previous conviction, and then any reincarceration for those that were incarcerated. So just a kind of a summary of the 10-year rearrest outcomes. What we see here is when we look at the match groups only, so the 10-year rearrest rate is higher for the firearm involved group when we look at that, the match compared to the match comparison group of the non-firearm involved group. So 67% had a 10-year rearrest rate compared to 41%. For the 10-year reconviction rate, we see the firearm involved group, the matched one, had 43% were reconvicted compared to the non-firearm involved group, which was reconvicted at 20%. And then the 10-year reincarceration rate for the firearm involved group, 43% compared to the non-firearm involved group was 35%. And you tend to see this obviously for all these different recidivism outcomes, that the matched firearm involved group had a higher percentage or a higher rate of recidivism compared to the matched non-firearm involved group. When we look at just the two firearm involved groups on any charges, what we see is the unmatched firearm involved group has a higher rearrest, reconviction, and reincarceration rate compared to the matched firearm group. So these are all individuals that had a firearm-related offense, which makes sense, seeing as that what we found was that they tended to be more serious offenses and to be more serious offenses in that sense. And then when we look at, again, at the two firearm involved groups for firearm charges only, and the reason why we do this is because the non-firearm involved group does not have inherently firearm involved. Their initial arrest is not for a firearms offense. We also see that the unmatched firearm group for both rearrest and reconviction are higher than the matched firearm group. And one of the limitations is that we couldn't get 10-year reincarceration rates for firearm charges because we're unable to determine whether, sometimes depending on the data, whether the reincarceration was due to a specific firearm-related offense, what charge they may have been actually reconvicted on. And this is just a basic kind of summary of recidivism within 10 years by measure and group membership. And we could just kind of talk about this, so I won't go too far into this as well. But as you can see, the unmatched firearm-involved group had a higher percentage compared to the rest. But when we look at the matched groups, so this red-ish color and this light blue color, you can see that the firearm-involved group tended to have a higher rate of rearrest for any charge, rearrest for firearm charges, reconviction, any reconviction, a firearm reconviction, and any reincarceration. So then I'm just going to briefly kind of talk about the demographics of the deceased based on the mortality data. So we were able to to identify 448 deaths through the mortality records. We were able to also identify another 12 individuals based on the CRI data. So CRI data will also input whether there was a death as well. And so we were able to kind of enhance that data, and that resulted in 460 individuals in the total sample that were deceased within that 10-year time frame. And so we can see predominantly male. What you'll see is that except the deceased for the firearm-involved group, 50% were white, but for the matched firearm group, not deceased, 52% identified as Black. But then the rest, you can see the matched and deceased are predominantly individuals that identified as Black. Their 2003, almost all of them had or a higher proportion of a felony charge for each of these groups. And then a higher percentage or proportion had a violent charge flag as well for their 2003 charge. Overall, I'll just kind of briefly go through this because I know we're running short on time, but overall there's a higher proportion of deaths that occurred beyond 3 years. So we looked at 3 years and then we looked at 10 years. So overall, a higher proportion of deaths occurred, from that 3 to 10-year time frame. A longer follow-up would have actually identified another 170 deceased individuals through May 2017. So about a fourth of the sample after that 10-year time frame, 170 additional individuals. Both the firearm groups, so the matched and unmatched ones, and more non-recidivists were deceased within 3 years of their 2003 arrest than beyond 3 years. And the matched non-firearm involved group had more deceased persons with non-recidivist statuses. This may also be a product of the non-firearm involved group had a higher proportion of deaths from natural causes. So when we specifically look at the proportion of homicide deaths during the 10-year follow-up period for the firearm involved groups compared to the non-firearm involved groups, what you will see is that for the firearm groups, just to clarify, this includes the matched and unmatched for this figure, but as I just mentioned, the non-firearm involved group had a higher percentage of deaths due to natural causes within the 10-year follow-up compared to the firearm involved group, which had a higher proportion of homicide related deaths during the 10-year follow-up. We also did survival analysis, and again, I won't go too far into that because I've had the pleasure of having 2 people explain that before me, but I'll just kind of go into we did several different versions of survival analyses and regression analyses, but I took what was the best fitted model. And what we found was that the factors that are associated with risk of rearrest for any charge, there's a 70% greater risk for those that were firearm involved, matched firearm involved versus the matched non-firearm involved. Greater likelihood if you were male, identified as Black, and younger at initial arrest at that 2003 arrest. The factors associated with risk of first rearrest for firearm charges, an 800% greater risk for firearm than non-firearm involved arrests. So those that had a previous history, essentially, of a firearm involved arrest had a greater risk of a future firearm involved arrest. Also, same other factors as well. Males identified as Black and younger at initial arrest. What was interesting is that the place of initial arrest was not statistically significant. So we didn't see a difference between Cook County and other parts of the state. what we did see was that when we incorporated information on exposure time, there was a reduction in time to rearrest. So it went from a median of 5 years to a median of 3.6 years. One of the last things I'll go through, we also conducted regression analyses for firearm-involved rearrests. As you can see here, these were the statistically significant factors. But overall, those in the firearm-involved group, the match one, if you were male, if you're younger at initial arrest, this resulted in increased likelihood of rearrest for a firearm offense. And the shorter time between initial arrest, so that 2003 arrest, and rearrest, there was a greater likelihood it was for a firearm offense. So the shorter the time frame between 2003 arrest and within those 10 years, greater likelihood of a firearm offense. Some limitations, and this kind of speaks to some of the limitations that were discussed by Dr. Serko as well. Some inconsistencies in demographic information within and between data sources. So because we're using multiple data sources, they also have demographic information, and sometimes they don't always match up. That also comes with the increase in how they report on different demographic information. For example, CRI data only recently incorporated ethnicity data. There's also limitations on record completeness. So court disposition data, about 20% were missing from CRI. And so it's possible that there was a higher proportion of convictions than we initially, than was reported out on. And the data is limited to only those legal system outcomes in Illinois, so we can't know if any deaths or recidivism occurred outside of the state of Illinois because we used all Illinois data. Same thing that Stephen also mentioned too is that for exposure time, we could not account for jail or detention, so we don't have statewide data or a data source for jail or detention that is largely circuit and county based. And the same for incapacitation due to non-fatal injury or disability or hospitalization, which speaks more to the public health data. And then there were limited independent variables, so we didn't have information on, socioeconomic variables, neighborhoods, and things like that. And just briefly, some key takeaways is to consider first-time firearm-related arrests for recidivism mortality risk, that there tends to be a higher risk of first-time firearm-related arrests for future firearm-related arrests, but also for mortality risk. It's also key to kind of look at and learn from persistently non-firearm involved individuals and what that group might look like and how to target that group. The other thing too, and this is really kind of one of the key things in this entire report, was applying a multidisciplinary approach to state social concerns by leveraging different agencies across the state for collaboration and to build capacity to match these various data sets to better understand criminal offending. This will become important too, and I do a lot of opioid research and substance use research and overdose research, is that mortality for some individuals, there's a higher rate among those that are justice involved, but there may be different subsets of those individuals who also may be at higher risk for mortality. And when we think of overdose, and those that have substantial or severe opioid use disorders or other addictions, that's something to consider for any other topics. And then the other thing too, and this is actually kind of similar to some of the other information, is to identify potential offending and mortality prevention through data-driven decision-making by using these different data sources. So what we found was the highest proportion of homicide victims were among 15 to 24-year-olds, predominantly males. And so being able to create prevention intervention. And what I will say is that Illinois does have ceasefire or focused deterrence type programs. They haven't been as evaluated as thoroughly as Dr. Serko, but I know that that's something that that is occurring, and whether it's effective or not is kind of a whole other question. And that's it for me. And I'm going to pass it back to Jason. I'm going to first click on the slide and pass it back to Jason.
Thanks, and I'd like to invite our discussant, Roger Przybylski, to take over from here.
Okay, thank you, Susan. I'm just kind of struck by the fact that I think I could spend the rest of the afternoon and all this evening engaging in a conversation with the three presenters on a variety of issues related to kind of planning and the execution of the work that you've done, and then also the use of it or the applications for policy and practice. I'm going to keep my eyes kind of focused on the chat box for any questions that come up, but one of the things that I'm struck by as well is really one of your key takeaways focused on the notion of multidisciplinary, if you will, kind of approaches and collaboration. And I have a question that I wanted to actually pose to all three of you as presenters, in that you've all used criminal history records to some extent in the work that you did and presented today. And this is a kind of key area of interest and visibility, I'm going to say, for SACs and a lot of researchers. And I was wondering if maybe the three of you could take a moment to comment on your work with criminal history record repositories, and particularly if you could just briefly touch on any key factors that you think are critically important for both being able to access criminal history records and then properly interpret and use those records given their complexity. I think I'd like to kind of start with that as an overall question for the three of you, if you'd like to just make a brief comment about those issues.
I'm happy to jump in. What I think is really unique about our SAC is that, so we're actually held under the governor's office here in Illinois, and we are lucky enough to have access to the criminal history record data. What I'll say is one of the really nice things about our current acting manager is he tends to provide a very thorough description of exactly what was pulled, how it was pulled down, and how to read the data. So there's kind of like a manual, and there's some manuals that I think having a manual and understanding the different data points is really important. I think also understanding that sometimes we see, errors in the data, but we work with Illinois State Police frequently to identify if there's, two state IDs, which are the unique identifiers for, the same person. But it's also important to understand too, and when we talk about arrest and arrest charges, those tend to be more fleshed out and more complete. And that's largely a product of all the police department agencies reporting up to the Illinois State Police and having in live scan fingerprinting. But the area that really is limited is court disposition and sentences, which is largely a product of making sure the courts input the data in there. And so that's somewhat of a limitation. But I think just being able to know where to access that. So for our state, you can reach out to our data person and request data either in aggregate or have an IRB application. And so I think just important to know where to get the data, and generally the people that have that data are going to help you kind of explain how to use it, because we also want it to be used in a way that is effective and accurate. I think if that answers your question a bit.
Sure, that's helpful. Stephen, Gio, anything you'd like to throw in with relation to working with criminal history records?
I'll just mention this briefly. I think Gio can attest to it. At least from a practical standpoint, there were definitely challenges that he and I both faced with matching up just the names and date of birth for the records that we had from DPD with Michigan State Police arrest records. So that was a fairly tedious process, and at times that was pretty challenging. That's the first thing that comes to mind, at least for me. I don't know if Gio also wants to mention anything.
I was going to say that it's also similar for us as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so some of the issues that go along with this, the gang intelligence data that we got, it was originally in paper records. Eventually that got translated into an Excel spreadsheet that was sort of passed around the gang intelligence unit. And so, one of the issues was that they didn't have a standardized way of putting in names. And so names would be misspelled or have, they put the word junior in there or something like that. So that made linking that up to the criminal history data challenging. And then just on the flip side, when you're working with criminal history data, especially if you're requesting a lot of records, you just have to think about ways of managing, the volume of data. And, at least in Michigan, the data comes in what's called a fixed width format. It's basically a result of an ancient system they're using at Michigan State Police still. And so there's some challenges in parsing that data out before you can even look at it like you would in a normal database. And so I think when if I was thinking about suggestions to other people that are going to be working with this type of data, you have to be aware of a lot of the pre-processing and work that goes into setting it up before you could even get to the point of doing any sort of analysis on it.
I would agree with that 100%. There's a lot of data cleaning and prepping before you can even analyze it.
Roger, we did have one question come in through chat, and folks, I want to remind you, you can still put your questions in chat even though the poll is up. The question is for Stephen, and it is, can the GunStat assessment scoring codes be shared?
Yeah, I responded in a private message. I would assume that they can, and maybe Geo can confirm, but I can provide that information after I check with Dr. McGarrell just to make sure that that's something that I can send. But in terms of the different scoring components, all of those were just categorical variables, so whether or not that component was present, and then the count of gun contacts was a numeric measure. And then, like I said, there's the threshold that kind of facilitates how the particular case is handled. But if anyone else would be interested in giving information on the codes, send me a message on here with your email, and I'll check and get back to you.
Thanks, Roger. I'll kick it back to you unless we get another question that comes in chat.
Great. I know we're kind of bumping up against time here, but there were a couple of other questions I wanted to try to get in if I can. And one of those relates to the use of survival analysis. And I know that generally people in the research community kind of recognize the value of doing that kind of an analytical work and so forth. But I mean, I might be an anomaly here, but a lot of times when we've talked about results from survival analysis with policymakers, they've not always kind of grasped how that can, the acceptance of that, or how that can relate to, sort of what we're doing policy-wise or practice-wise. And I was wondering, since survival analysis was something that was done in both Illinois and then in the Detroit work, I'm curious from your perspectives about, obviously, there are key kind of implications in what's been found in the survival analysis, but I'm curious about whether the folks that you're working with in terms of practitioners or policymakers in your jurisdictions, how they are kind of grasping what we're finding in survival analysis, and whether or not they can see sort of the implications of that for what's being done on the ground policy-wise and practitioner-wise. If that question makes sense, I'd like to pose that to all of you.
I mean, I'll just say that I haven't directly dealt with explaining, because again, this is a report that I have acknowledgement on, but I didn't fully do. But it can be difficult, I think, to explain kind of the utility of it. But I think the utility of understanding, of having survival analysis, is really to understand kind of what offending looks like more long term, and also desistance or stopping of offending behavior. And so I think it can provide a bit more information as to to targeting policies to when people are most at risk for reoffending, which can provide more specific services and support to reduce that reoffending. But ultimately, I haven't really dealt directly with speaking with policymakers and other stakeholders specifically in relation to this with survival analysis. So I don't know if Gio or Stephen have, but that would be my kind of 2 cents.
Yeah, what you're pointing out is really, it's not unique necessarily to the specific survival analysis. I mean, just the challenge overall of how do we translate science to, policymakers. And so we know that people that are, who are making policy sometimes don't have the same background in all these kind of esoteric experimental designs. And so at least when it comes to trying to explain what I'm doing, I'll present the results, but I think I like to try and couch those terms in some, more practical numbers. And so if we talk about survival analysis and we say that, given this policy, we'd expect this number of people over this period of time to be arrested compared to this number. And so I feel like sometimes translating it in terms of more substantive measures sometimes is more helpful than digging into statistics and talking about, percents and 2 times more likely and so on. So I think a lot of times it's just framing that can really help people that are focused more on the more policy end. And that's where I've seen the most success in general.
Thanks, Gio. Stephen, anything to add? If not, that's cool.
No, I actually appreciated that advice from Gio. I think we're sharing our preliminary findings with DPD this coming week, so that'll be something to keep in mind.
Cool. Okay. I think one follow-up I had kind of for Gio, and maybe this kind of extends to Lily as well in the work that was done in Illinois. One of the things that struck me in your findings had to do with the notion of, if I was following correctly, that individuals who had been a victim of gun crime, that there was an association between that factor and future, offending. And I was curious, from all of your standpoints about your kind of take on an issue like this, because when I think about it, what I'm kind of curious about overall in the context of your work, and then just larger as a issue across the country, is kind of the overlap between victimization and offending. And one of the things I guess I wanted to ask is do you have any future, I think, aspirations, if you will, to be able to dig a little bit deeper into that issue, and specifically maybe in terms of what prior victimization might mean in terms of an association with criminal justice interventions and sanctions, and a larger issue relating to, I think, that when you were talking about the Detroit experience, that being able to identify certain individuals that might be appropriate targets for interventions, like something like a focused deterrence model or ceasefire, how that may play with individuals who are obtaining guns or have guns for self-defense and protection, and particularly because they've been victimized in the past. I hope that makes some sense, but I was just curious. I find that to be an interesting and kind of striking finding, Stephen, that you talked about, and just wondering if there are any comments or thoughts on the larger issues that are related to that by any of you that presented this afternoon.
I mean, I can speak a bit to it, but yeah, I think that it's really important to consider that, and I think this speaks a lot to what was what my colleagues over here presented as well, is that there is we should have substantial consideration for victimization and offending behavior for for our study, it really looked more at mortality. And what we saw was that individuals who had been involved in firearm offenses had higher rates of mortality. And so to that end, they're at risk for fatal death. But, we are, I kind of can speak more to like kind of the last part, is that we are actually using a lot of this data to look at differences between firearm and non-firearm homicide victimizations and criminal history information. I think the one thing that can be quite difficult is getting victimization data and being able to connect that with this type of data as well. Especially when you're talking about large data sets of individuals. But what can help is, I think we've done a lot of work working with our Illinois Department of Public Health on emergency admission data, so looking at that kind of data and being able to connect it. But also sometimes I think the one kind of potential challenge is getting more specific victimization data to really get deep into understanding that how victimization and offending overlap. And I'll let Gio and Stephen speak more to it, because I think their presentations really spoke quite well to that.
Yes, I mean, just thinking about the overlap in victimization and offending, I mean, we tend to find in general is that, gun violence occurs within, largely within fairly small networks of individuals. So there's a lot of other research, including stuff out of Chicago, that looks at, the social networks of gun offending. And so, this overlap ties into the whole ceasefire focused deterrence message. So when we're thinking about, likely offenders, they're just as likely in some cases to be victims as well. So that's actually part of the message that's delivered in the ceasefire program. And so when we're looking at, recidivism, we're looking at violent offending, the propensity to be a victim as well as an offender is, equally important. So like with the deterrent, the idea with the deterrent, focused deterrence message is that we can try and affect other people that are connected to these individuals that call in a meeting based on their shared social network. So there's obviously some importance in knowing both victimization and offending as well.
I actually not going to add anything. I think I would mostly reiterate to a large extent what Gio was saying there.
Great, thank you. I appreciate you, everyone weighing in. One last question before I'll close out. It might be more focused towards Gio, but anybody wants to comment, please feel free. I'm just curious if, given the kind of growth and prevalence of focused deterrence across the country, and what you were talking about, Gio, particularly in terms of the need for quality data, I'm curious if you would have any recommendations for focused deterrence programs, and particularly the practitioners that are running those programs, in terms of being able to kind of develop and, if you will, keep and sort of maintain the kind of data that's going to be needed to be able to do the kind of analyses and evaluations of these approaches that you've been able to accomplish in Detroit. And given some of the struggles that were mentioned about the availability of data, anything that you might recommend for programs going forward across the country in terms of data development and having the information needed to be able to assess what's going on properly?
Yeah, I mean, so at least in my experience in Detroit, a lot of the easy part is getting the data on shooting incidents. So most police department records management systems, if someone is shot or assaulted with a gun, that's going to show up in the records management system. When it comes to the focused deterrence part of it, the real challenge is identifying people who are going to be good targets for the focused deterrence. And so the real challenge is trying to get the right people into the room. So when we're working with the ceasefire working group, the biggest challenge we had from between 2013 and 2015 was getting people that knew enough at the street level or knew enough about these crime incidents that we were reviewing to give us more detailed information, so we could say that this incident is related to this person and this person's in this gang and they're connected to these two other people who are also in that gang, and all three of them are causing trouble, and then they need to be put on this list. And so obviously you need to have fairly accurate crime data, but the real value is making sure that you're having the right people coming to the meetings and giving the useful kind of ground level information, because without that it's very, very difficult to find the meaningful targets, basically the high value individuals, the people that we can reach out to, bring to call-in meetings, and disrupt these networks. It's not necessarily something you can just figure out looking solely at the data. So there definitely is a kind of a qualitative aspect to these focus deterrence programs and trying to identify people that way as well. So yeah, I think that's probably one of the biggest, most important things that we experienced in terms of going from not being very effective to being much more effective was getting all the right people in one room together.
I was just going to say, like, the one thing I think too is, like, on the back end, after we've done some stuff with focus deterrence in Illinois, and we fund some focus deterrence programs through our agency. But I think the one thing too is really getting people to collaborate and share data, but in collecting it as well, making sure a lot of social service and human service agencies have their own case management systems, and so making sure that always helps to reach out to a researcher to help identify what are we missing. But I think just being able to identify services that are offered, services provided, whether they've, completed them, how many hours and things like that, to really understand kind of that dosage as well. And I guess the process, I'm a little bit of a corrections person. So being able to identify, is this enough service and intervention that's going to actually help reduce that recidivism, not only from the call-ins and holding people accountable, but also from the service provisions that are being offered on the back end, and whether that's sufficient or enough dosage to really help reduce that recidivism and really target those criminogenic needs or those risk factors that are related to reoffending.
Thank you, Lily. I appreciate your comments from everyone. I know we're at the bottom of the hour here, and we've gone a little bit long, so I'm going to close things out here with a giant thank you to Stephen and Gio and Lily, not only for showcasing the fabulous work that you've been doing and the work that the SACs have been done in Michigan and in Illinois, but also for the contributions that you're making with your analytical work and your research to being able to intervene and combat, firearms violence and violence overall in the communities. Thank you for 3 wonderful presentations and being a part of this. And I want to thank everybody in the audience as well for being with us today. And I hope that this was a valuable session for you. And keep in mind that we've got one more day in our criminology series that will take place tomorrow afternoon. So with that, let me just say a giant thank you to everybody that's been involved, both presenters, audience members, and people behind the scenes. And we look forward to our day tomorrow, which will be the last day of our criminology series. Thank you all very, very much.